out what you want to face up under the hood of the truck. So the first thing you want to face, you want to go from top to bottom. So you checking the coolant, where you keep the coolant in here, checking the sight glass, make sure it's at the proper level, checking all the hoses, checking the hoses and clamps, make sure your hose is not dry rotted. Alright? Checking your power steering fluid, where you keep your power steering fluid at. Checking your hoses on the power steering fluid to make sure there's not leaking, and also checking the clamps. Checking the steering shaft, make sure it's not bent, and make sure the universal joint is properly greased. Checking your power steering gearbox, making sure your power steering gearbox is properly mounted, and your power steering gearbox is not leaking, you're not missing any bolts. And checking your hoses, make sure your hose is not leaking. Checking your drag linkage arm, checking your bolts and your cotter pins, and make sure they're not missing and your drag linkage arm is not bent. Also checking your hoses. Checking your brake chamber, make sure your brake chamber is properly mounted. Checking your casing around the brake chamber, make sure it's properly secure and tight. Checking your slack adjuster, make sure your slack adjuster doesn't move no more than an inch. Checking your push rod, making sure your push rod is not bent. Checking your brake shoes and brake drum, make sure it's not rubbing metal to metal. Checking your leaf springs, make sure your leaf spring is not cracked with no separation in your leaf springs. Checking your leaf spring clamp, making sure it's properly secure. Checking your leaf spring U-bolts, which is mounted to your axle. Looking at your axle, making sure your axle is not bent. Checking your steering rod, making sure your steering rod is not bent. Not steering rod, tie rod. Checking your tie rod, making sure your tie rod is not bent. Checking your cotter pins and your bolts, and make sure there's nothing missing from your cotter pins or bolts. Checking the frame, looking at your frame, make sure your frame is not bent, and make sure there haven't any missing bolts from your frame. Checking your oil, make sure your oil is at the right level. Looking at your fan, make sure your fan is not bent and not pushing up against your radiator. Looking at your water pump right below your fan. Looking at your water pump, make sure your water pump is not leaking. Looking at your water pump, make sure your water pump belt don't pull no more than 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch plate. And also looking at the belt, make sure the belt is not dry rotted or not frayed. Looking at your compressor, make sure your compressor is properly mounted. Looking at your hose on the compressor, make sure the hose is not leaking. On your belt, also can't pull no more than 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch plate within your belt, and make sure it's not dry rotted, not frayed. So move around the other side of the vehicle. As you look inside, looking at the transmission, checking your transmission, make sure it's at the proper level. Looking at your air filter, making sure your air filter is clean. Looking at your alternator, making sure your alternator is properly mounted. Making sure your wires are tight on your alternator. Looking at your belt, make sure your belt is not dry rotted, not frayed. Make sure your belt can't pull no more than 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch plate. So on your alternator again, making sure it's properly mounted. There's no missing bolts from your alternator. Looking at your wires, make sure your wires is properly connected. Your belt can't pull no more than 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch plate. Looking at your hoses, to make sure they're not dry rotted. Looking at your clamps, make sure your clamps are secure. Looking at your drag linkage arm. Looking at your bolts and your cotter pins. Make sure your bolts and your cotter pins is not missing. Looking at your steering box, making sure your steering box is properly mounted, and also making sure it's not leaking in the fluid. Looking at your leaf spring mounts, to make sure your leaf spring mounts is properly mounted, there is no missing bolts. Looking at your leaf springs to make sure they're properly secure. Looking at your leaf spring U-bolt, looking at your leaf spring U-clamp, which is clamped around the leaf spring. Looking at your leaf spring U-bolt, which is mounted to the axle. And looking at the axle, make sure the axle is not bent. All right, so that's everything up on the hood of the vehicle.